Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to my channel. I'm Ben. Today, we will step into a chilling case of a mysterious disappearance that blurred the line between family loyalty and hidden secrets. A disabled man who vanished right before a niece's wedding, while his phone strangely kept sending texts and even answered calls in another woman's voice. What truly happened on that fateful November night? Let's begin. The camera lingered on a wedding that should have been pure brightness. Silk glimmered under winter light, a white dress cut like a clean path through the crowd. Rouge set upon the bride's cheekbones, and a groom in a dark suit, trying to wear joy like a mantle. Yet from the first minute to the last, the bride did not truly smile. Her eyes kept drifting toward the entrance, toward the place where family members filed in with envelopes and polite bows. Someone was missing, and that absence weighed upon the music, upon the red paper ornaments trembling on the door like small hearts. This was late in 2011 in Shenmue, a county-level city in Shanxi province in northern China, where winters can be thin and dry and where the year closes with weddings and reunions. The bride's favorite uncle had promised to attend, not just as a guest, but as the officiant, the family's chosen host at the ceremony. His name, written on a disability card and repeated in family chats, was Xie Binbin, depending on tone marks that vanish in casual speech. Some said Binbin, others Binbin. A reminder that in Pinyin, the same letters can hide different meanings. He was 41 years old, a husband and a father of two. A man whose left leg had been weakened by childhood illness, so that he walked with a slight hitch, as if the ground occasionally gave way beneath him. Days earlier, he had vanished. In missing person stories, families usually move quickly. Many report within 24 hours when calls fail or routines break. Occasionally, the delay stretches into weeks or months because the missing person works far from home or speaks rarely with relatives. But here, the man lived locally. He worked nearby. He was bound to return for the wedding. Even so, no report was filed at once. The reasons for that hesitation would slowly surface, like stains revealed after water evaporates. On a noon in November of 2011, his sister-in-law phoned his younger brother. "Come check the house," she said. It was lunchtime, and her husband had not appeared at the family eatery to help, as he often did, despite the separation that had cooled their marriage. The younger brother's home stood only a few doors away, and the short walk taught him nothing, except that silence can be a sound. He found the door locked from the outside. He knocked and called his brother's name. No answer came. One day later, a text arrived from a number they did not recognize. The sender claimed to be Bin Bin. He wrote that he had gone to Tongchuan to buy a home and to be with his lover. Tongchuan lies more than 600 kilometers, roughly more than 373 miles, from Shenmue, a long pull across Shanxi by highway or rail. The message did not ask for help. It pointed away, as if the writer were closing a door behind him. Infidelity was not a secret in this family. People knew Binbin had been involved with a woman from Tongchuan. The plan to purchase a home for her had been mentioned before, perhaps in half-serious boasts, perhaps in quiet confessions that carry the smell of alcohol. About half a year earlier, he and his wife had drifted into a trial separation. They still operated the eatery together, she in charge, he helping, and the business provided him with a monthly sum that kept him in the family orbit. Then a friend named Yu phoned to ask about a food supplier. He dialed the number saved under Binbin's name, the one he had called many times. A woman's voice answered. She sounded like a local from Tongchuan. Yu asked if she was holding Binbin's phone and if she could pass it to him. The woman sighed, impatient, and said this was her number, not his. You knew what he had dialed. Muscle memory and a contact list do not both fail in the same instant. He pressed, was she the girlfriend? The woman said Binbin was not with her and ended the call. That moment was like a splinter beneath the fingernail. You can barely see it, but it pricks each time you touch anything. If Binbin had truly fled to Tongchuan, why would the old number suddenly belong to a different woman? If he was alive and proud enough to admit the relationship to his family, why would he hide behind a stranger's curt denial? And if the number had been reassigned by the carrier, an unlikely speed, why would the first person to answer sound as if she had been bothered too many times already? The household tried to supply reasonable answers. Maybe he had traveled to Tongchuan to finalize the purchase. Maybe the lovers had argued, and he had left his phone somewhere. Maybe pride or shame was keeping him away until tempers cooled. The mind is excellent at building bridges across gaps of fact, especially when the alternative is terror. In the neighborhood, the eatery had become a small axis around which the family's days spun. Years earlier, after the village's land was reclaimed for development, compensation had allowed Binbin and his wife to start the business and then add a row of rental rooms above it. She managed the money, suppliers, and staff. He wandered in like an aging planet with a gentle orbit, not always punctual, sometimes useful, always present. It is easy to overlook the gravity of such presence until it is gone. News of his planned move to Tongchuan had not surprised everyone. What did surprise them was how the man vanished during a season when family obligations thicken. In China, Lunar New Year, known in Vietnamese communities as Tet Nguyen Dan, is not merely a holiday, but the central reunion of the year. When children travel home, debts are squared, and houses are scrubbed of last year's misfortune. In such weeks, even estranged relatives appear at doorways with fruit and red envelopes. The bride, staring at the entrance, was not just waiting for an uncle. She was waiting for a signal that kinship still bound them together. The messages kept trickling in, at first brief notes, insisting he was fine, urging them not to worry, insisting he would return when he could. They were curiously efficient messages. They sprang onto the screen, as if typed by someone who knew a keyboard well. But Binbin had not finished much school. Chinese characters must be memorized, not sounded out. And he was not a fast typist on computers or phones. The speed and smoothness of the replies did not sound like him. Doubt pooled and became something denser. Friendships and marriages form a web. Pull one thread and another quivers. There was also the matter of distance and money. If he truly was in Tongchuan arranging a purchase, why were there no calls, only texts? Why did his old number suddenly route to a woman? Why did everything that might anchor him work? Children, promises loosen all at once. The bride's wedding ended without a smile from her. Families dispersed with late-night fatigue and early morning gossip, talking quietly about disgrace and romance, and the way men in midlife try to recut their destinies like suits. In that dark, winter air, the absence grew into a shape everyone could feel. The family waited for Lunar New Year, telling themselves that if he did not return for the one reunion that matters most, they would act. The city around them is important to imagine. Shenmu sits near the Ordos Basin, where the land undulates, coal feeds factories, and the wind carries dust across wide roads. At night, the red neon of eateries makes doorways glow like furnace mouths. In a place like this, the simplest explanation he ran off with a lover can root itself quickly, but simple explanations sometimes sprout from careful lies. As those early days passed, the small details that should have given comfort only raised more questions. House locked from the outside. A text from a strange number that knew too much. A friend's call diverted to a woman who cut the conversation with the clean edge of impatience. A family that wanted to trust routine, yet felt the familiar rhythms grow false. Like a song played, just slightly off tempo. Later chapters would reveal what happened behind those details. How a call can be diverted and a family misled. How distance can be an alibi and not a fact. But in that first stretch, from the wedding's solemn joy to the trickle of unlikely messages, the most human parts of this story appeared clearly. Hope, trying hard to hold the line. Pride, covering fear. And the way a missing person can reshape a room without ever entering it. When the family finally stood at the edge of the new year and weighed action against superstition, they understood a truth that comes to all families who wait too long. Silence is not always absence. Sometimes it is a design, and a design, even the most careful one, leaves edges you can feel. If part 1 was absence felt at a wedding, part 2 was the anatomy of that absence. How a man can be edited out of daily life with small, plausible strokes. Friends said you had a practical mind. On an ordinary errand, he dialed the number saved under Shea Binbin's name to ask about a food supplier. He had called this contact many times. The call connected, and a woman answered with the faint cadence of Tongchuan in her vowels. He asked if Binbin was there. She sighed, weary in a way that suggested this was not the first such call, and said the number was hers. Yu checked himself. Muscle memory and a contact list. Do not misfire together, he pressed. Was she the girlfriend? The woman snapped a denial, said Binbin was not with her, and ended the call. People around Binbin tried to reason away the splinter. Maybe he had traveled to Tongchuan to finalize a purchase for his lover. Maybe the pair had quarreled and he had left his phone behind. Maybe pride would keep him silent until he could return with a plan. It was easier to stitch a story than to admit fear. To understand why the stitches held as long as they did, you must know the family's history. His wife, a native of Tongchuan also, had been sent to Shenmu at 17 to marry into a household that owned little beyond hope and will. Years of hustle had reshaped their fortunes. Compensation from land redevelopment became seed money for a small eatery. Later, they added a row of rooms for rent upstairs. She ran the business with a manager's spine suppliers, cash, staff, while Binbin orbited the counter, useful in bursts, unreliable in timekeeping, always present. Presence has a gravity. Its loss is not just space, but weight suddenly gone. Pity, too, has a gravity. When a fellow Tongchuan woman arrived in Shenmu looking for work, his wife rented a room to her at half the usual price. The logic was old as any village. Help your own. It made what came next taste more bitter. The family file would later record that Binbin began an affair with the tenant soon after she moved in. One day his wife opened a door and saw the two embracing. After that, she expelled the woman. A separation followed, not an official divorce, but the quiet kind that announces itself through routines. He lived in a separate room. She stayed at the rental house above the eatery. They agreed to stop policing each other's movements for the sake of the children and the business. In such arrangements, a kind of lull descends. Relatives stop asking hard questions because the surface has steadied. They saw the couple's pact, believed it had settled like dust, and returned to their own chores. When Binbin later vanished, they first assumed he had taken another of his trips to Tongchuan. A week passed, then a second. The wedding of his niece drew near. He had promised to officiate and buy gold as a gift. His absence stretched from odd to ominous. During the first days, text messages continued to appear from unfamiliar numbers, claiming to be him. The tone was breezy. Efficient. I am fine. Do not worry. I will be back when I can. Then even those messages stopped. A family never forgets how silence ends. Here it ended on the 6th day of the Lunar New Year in 2012, when a message arrived on social media. In many places across China, that 6th day is when businesses reopen and households move from ritual to routine. The timing soothed some, as if the calendar itself had authorized contact. The chat thread from that day reads like a script someone had rehearsed. Family members asked where he was. He did not answer. He claimed he was doing business out of town, that the money he had carried was already invested, and that he could not return immediately. When they asked for a video call, he replied that he was outside and it was inconvenient. Moments later, he went offline and did not return. Doubt puckered their trust. The speed of the replies was wrong. Bin had finished only 2nd grade. He could read and write, but haltingly. In Chinese, characters are memorized, not built from a small alphabet, and input methods require familiarity to be fast. He was not a deft typist on phones or computers. The messages that claimed to be his appeared with the clean speed of someone who had trained fingers and time. Everyone noticed, but no one wanted to say it did not sound like him. His wife's relatives added what they knew. After being caught, the lover let us call her Miss Wang had been told to leave the rental. The couple lived their separate lives. But word around the neighborhood was that Bin continued to visit Tongchuan. It matched his earlier boast that he would buy an apartment there, settle, and stay. Tongchuan, remember, sits more than 600 kilometers, roughly more than 373 miles, from Shenmue. It is far enough that a man can build a second self between departures and returns. Weeks after the last message, the family decided guessing was a luxury they could no longer afford. They went to Tongchuan to find Miss Wang. The scene they walked into had the stale air of a room that has hosted too many arguments. Miss Wang said she had not seen Bin for a long time. She knew nothing about his disappearance. Her affect was impatience, dressed as indifference. They learned she had a new boyfriend. She told them not to disturb her new life. A person may tell the truth in such a tone. A liar may adopt it too. What relatives heard was a door closing in their faces. What if she was telling the truth? The family tried to model that branch of the story. Perhaps Bin had arrived in Tongchuan and found her with another man. Ashamed, he might have refused to return home, drifting to some other city to work and to lick his wounds. Chinese families are endlessly patient with such ideas, especially as Lunar New Year approaches. The holiday is more than fireworks and dumplings. It is an anchor. Children travel home. Debts are squared. Houses are scrubbed clean of last year's ill luck. The family decided to wait until the holiday passed. If he did not come back by then, they would report him missing. Waiting was a ritual too. It let them delay saying out loud what they feared most. The wedding's missing smile became the New Year's missing chair at the table. Meanwhile, small facts grew sharper. The front door locked from the outside. On the day he vanished, the sudden rerouting of calls. The reassignment of a familiar number to a stranger who bristled as if she had been fielding questions for days. If someone wanted to manufacture distance, they had been careful. Texts pointed to Tongchuan. Calls led to a woman who could plausibly wave them on. The 6th day message suggested an investor's busyness, not a victim's crisis. Everything deferred urgency. Underneath the plausible was something colder. Anyone who has worked long around missing person cases will tell you that silence has a design when it benefits someone. A designed silence has seams. Here, the seams had texture you could feel with your fingertips. A man not known for texting, now sending quick, clean replies. An old number becoming new overnight, with a user who felt rehearsed in denial. An affair that created a natural explanation for a vanishing. At last, the relatives returned from Tongchuan with more questions than answers. They counted days as they prepared lanterns and rice cakes, clocking time not by the Gregorian calendar, but by the ritual steps that carry families through winter. Cleaning, visiting, cooking, bowing. The sixth day arrived, with its permission to get back to business. And with it came the chat that sounded almost, but not quite, like Bin Bin. The family set the phone down and looked at one another. In that look was the realization that someone else might be holding the pen to this story. In the end, their decision was the simplest and hardest one: to stop building bridges of comfort across gaps of fact. They would report the disappearance. They would ask law enforcement to tear at the seams of the design. They would test the numbers, check call forwards, and trace the threads that had been so neatly laid toward Tongchuan. Part 2 ends not with discovery, but with suspicion, hardened into action. The precise moment when a family stops explaining and starts investigating. When families finally stopped explaining the absence and stepped into a police station, it was the 7th day of the Lunar New Year in 2012, the day many shops reopen and households pivot from ritual back to routine. Their decision came after a night of second thoughts and a dawning certainty that the person on the other end of the chat was not Xie Binbin at all. In Chinese, characters must be memorized as shapes and sounds. They are not assembled from an alphabet. Binbin had finished only 2nd grade, could read and write, but slowly, and never typed quickly. Yet the replies they received were rapid and clean, the work of trained fingers. Doubt hardened into action. Investigators began with the network that had kept hope alive. Phones. The call detail records looked ordinary at a glance, and then resolved into 2 sharp anomalies. The first sat in early November of 2011. In the small hours of a single night, call forwarding had been switched on for Binbin's number, routing incoming calls to a different handset. For anyone unfamiliar, call forwarding is a feature that shunts calls elsewhere when the original phone is busy, out of coverage, or deliberately set to forward. Companies use it for hotlines and after-hours desks, but private users rarely leave it on for long. Here, it pointed to the number used by his lover in Tongchuan. That small act explained a friend's experience perfectly when he dialed Binbin. A woman in Tongchuan kept answering and insisting the number was hers. The system had been taught to make her the gatekeeper. The second anomaly arrived one day after the disappearance. Someone walked into a telecom branch in Shenmue with Binbin's national identification card and registered a brand new number. The new SIM woke up on November 4th and knocked Daesh by 4 in the afternoon. Began sending text messages to relatives and friends. The messages were soft reassurances. He was fine. He was out on business. He would return after his investment settled. No one received a call, only texts. After 5 days, the number went dark on November 9th and never rose again. That cadence, alive just long enough to soothe and then vanish, looked less like communication and more like a prop. From these 2 threads, the same picture took shape. If a man had simply run off with a lover, he would not need to forward calls to her phone, and then, using his own identification, activate a new line that existed only to text and then die. He had bragged before about the relationship. He had even spoken of buying an apartment in Tongchuan, a city more than 600 kilometers, roughly more than 373 miles from Shenmue. A person that open does not suddenly cultivate secrecy unless someone else needs him to be silent. Detectives wrote the word design in their notes, an acknowledgement that silence can be engineered. The design here was neat. Forward the calls to the girlfriend's number so that anyone dialing hears a plausible voice. Register a fresh line with the victim's papers to issue tidy updates. Stop the line after 5 days so that the trail grows cold but not alarming. Each step nudged the family toward patience. Each step postponed a report. Before the interviews began in earnest, officers documented the man at the center of the case. Bin Bin had been left with a weakened left leg by childhood illness and walked with a faint hitch, as if a stone lived in his shoe. He married in 1994 and had 2 children, a daughter of 15 and a son of 8 when he vanished. He was born to a farming family on the outskirts of Shenmu, married a woman from Tongchuan through the introductions of elders, and clawed his way up with her. When the village land was reclaimed, compensation provided seed money for a small eatery. Later, they built rental rooms above it. In time, the marriage frayed. Half a year before he disappeared, his wife had caught him with a tenant from Tongchuan and expelled the woman. Husband and wife then separated in practice, if not on paper, continued to run the business, and agreed not to police one another's movements. The affair created a ready-made story for a vanishing. It also created motive for lies. With phone records in hand, Shenmu officers traveled to Tongchuan to find the woman often named in family gossip, a Miss Wang. The officers found a room that smelled of arguments long finished and rehearsed denials ready to be spoken. Miss Wang admitted the relationship. She insisted she knew nothing about the disappearance. She could not explain why call forwarding from his phone had been set to hers. She had, she said, moved on and had a new boyfriend. Her tone was impatience wearing indifference like a coat. A truthful person can speak that way. So can a liar. What investigators heard was not proof, only a practiced distance. Meanwhile, the family's timeline stabilized around ritual. In northern China, Lunar New Year is more than a holiday. It is the reunion that refuses to be missed. Children come home. Houses are scrubbed clean of last year's ill luck. And after the lanterns are hung, the 6th day signals it is time to return to business. So, when a message arrived on that 6th day, saying money was already invested and a return was inconvenient, it sounded almost reasonable. But reason was exactly what the design needed, a little logic mortar to hold the wall upright. The detectives returned to their whiteboard and drew 3 arrows. One pointed to the locked door noted by the younger brother on the noon. He went to look for Bin Bin, an exterior lock that suggested control from outside. Another pointed to the reassigned voice, answering the old number, a woman fielding calls as if she had been bothered many times already. The third arrow pointed to the 5-day number, born on November 4th, texting by 4 in the afternoon, dead on November 9th. Each arrow ended at the same word, staging. To this point, there was still no body, no confessed violence, only a pattern that breathed like someone trying to stay ahead of a clock. What makes such patterns brittle is the human texture inside them. Friends remembered Bin Bin's slow messages, his preference for talking, not typing. His wife's relatives remembered how quickly the lover had been removed from the rental after being discovered. Neighbors remembered Bin Bin boasting that he would settle in Tongchuan for good. If he had truly achieved that plan, he would have had no reason to hide behind a silent phone and another person's voice. By the time Part 3 closes, the family's grief has shifted registers. What began as worry and then as patience has become a suspicion they can pick up with their hands. The police, armed with logs and denials and a design that keeps showing its seams, now have a direction. Follow the forwarding. Follow the new line purchased with the victim's identification. Follow the people who benefited from this carefully built silence. The investigation is no longer about a man who may have run away. It is about a man whose communications were arranged by someone else, and arrangements, however neat, leave fingerprints. The first definitive crack in the story appeared 5 days after Xie Binbin vanished. A text message lit up Miss Wang's phone in Tongchuan. The sender claimed to be Binbin and said he was on the way to Tongchuan, instructing her to meet him at the railway station. She asked which hall, which exit, which bench. The replies stayed vague. The station, nothing more. Suspicion pushed past pride. She dialed the same number. A woman answered. The voice said Binbin was drunk and sleeping, could not come to the phone. Then cut the line. In that instant, Miss Wang's anger hardened. If she was the mistress, had a second woman now appeared. Her belief curdled into contempt. After that call, Binbin never contacted her again. She soon found a new boyfriend. And when the Shi family later came to Tongchuan for answers, she met them with cold impatience. For investigators, the station message was not romance. It was design. Someone wanted Miss Wang looking outward toward Tongchuan, not inward toward Shenmu. Someone wanted a plausible explanation that could be repeated at dinner tables. He left to buy an apartment. He is commuting between cities. It is messy but ordinary. Yet the mechanics under that story, the call forwarding to Miss Wang's line, the brand new number registered with Binbin's identification and used only to text reassurances for 5 days before going dark, were the kind of careful steps that strangers do not take. They require access, familiarity, patience. They require someone close. The detectives set the likely motives on the table where everyone could see them: grievance, money, and love. In many cases, those 3 pillars hold the roof over violence. Which way would this roof lean? They tested grievance first and found little wind to push in that direction. Binbin had no loud enemies in business. He was the nominal boss of a small eatery with rental rooms above, but in truth, his wife managed suppliers, books, and staff. He did not travel widely. Long absences did not fit his habits or his discomfort with his weakened left leg. He stayed close to Shenmu, close to routine. The social circle was limited. Most relatives in Shenmu, a few in Inner Mongolia, and the lover in Tongchuan. When officers canvassed, no one described a feud big enough to swallow a man. Money was trickier. Years earlier, when village land was reclaimed, the compensation had seeded small prosperity. Many households spoke of several 100,000 yuan, sometimes even more than 1 million yuan. Sums that can change how people speak to one another. The couple had even lent out a significant amount and later recovered it shortly before the disappearance. That recovery, however, had a shadow. The borrowers stalled and pleaded until, frustrated, the couple hired enforcers, a debt collection crew with underworld ties, to apply pressure. Threats flew. The debtors capitulated, negotiated a small rise in interest, and asked for 3 months to repay. They did repay in full after 3 months. Then came the argument no one likes to have. Who, exactly, deserved to be paid? The couple decided the repayment had come by negotiation, not force. They refused to pay the collectors. The collectors responded with threats, slashes, and murders, spoken as if they were verbs for tomorrow. But when police traced alibis for the day of the disappearance, the debt crew held up records, witnesses, routine. The threats were noise, not proof. The ledgers at the eatery and rental rooms told no different story. The money pillar did not fall, but it did not carry the roof either. That left love, or its more precise components: jealousy, humiliation, control. The affair with Miss Wang had been nakedly known. His wife had once opened a door to find the pair embracing in a rented room and expelled the woman. Afterward, a quiet separation replaced the marriage in practice. 2 beds, 2 routines, a truce for the children and the business. In neighborhoods like these, truce can look like peace until it is not. Miss Wang's later account to police hung together on petty details: the text, the station, the woman's voice answering, the sudden silence thereafter, and then, on a mood, the feeling of being baited, the sense that someone was steering attention toward her so that she would absorb the gaze. Whatever else Miss Wang was, she was likely not the engineer of forwarding calls or registering new numbers with someone else's papers. That labor smelled domestic. Investigators returned to the mechanics. Why forward Binbin's calls to Miss Wang's number at all, unless you wanted every curious friend to hit a plausible wall? Why create a new line with his identification, use it to send tidy texts for 5 days, and then kill it, unless you needed the illusion of life long enough for a wedding to pass, for Lunar New Year to be navigated without a report? A stranger who harmed a man on the street does not also volunteer to run his customer service desk. The person who builds a communications design often lives at the same table where those phones ring. Still, detectives did not allow theory to outrun proof. They interviewed the debt crew again, walked the alleys between the eatery and the rental rooms, paged through purchase orders and deposits. They mapped the who benefits arc: who gained time from a family soothed by texts, who escaped confrontation during a niece's wedding, who avoided a report to police until the 7th day of the new year, who could lock a door from the outside, who knew which relatives to text and how to mimic a man who typed slowly and avoided messaging. Each arrow on the board sharpened the same conclusion: the crime's author had studied Binbin, not his public face, but his habits. They also allowed for the wild card: another woman, a 4th person in Miss Place. Wang's angry arithmetic. Was there truly a new lover who answered the station day call? If so, was she mastermind or instrument? On paper, a new mistress provided motive, but the texting pattern and forwarding architecture still looked like housework, not a side project. To harm a man and then undertake days of calm messaging to multiple relatives requires inside knowledge of the family tree and the confidence to use his papers at a local carrier shop. That is not the profile of a drive-by romance. It is the profile of a home. By the close of this chapter, Shenmue police had reduced a landscape of possibilities to a narrow corridor. Grievance dwindled, money thinned, love remained, edged with humiliation and the small, daily tyrannies of a failing marriage. The case now turned from where to who, from the public design to the private hands that built it. The next step would be to pull that design apart thread by thread and test the seams for prints. By the time winter thinned into ritual and back again, the case had begun to narrow. Police checked passenger lists and found no train or long-distance bus record placing Xia Binbin in Tongchuan in November of 2011. The woman there, the one everyone called the lover, had found a new boyfriend after the disappearance. She was impatient, but in the arithmetic of motive and opportunity, she did not add up for investigators. The Tongchuan chapter began to look like a decoy written by someone who wanted the family to stare at a far platform. So they pivoted home. One detail returned like a quiet bell. On the noon, his wife phoned the younger brother and asked him to check the house because Binbin had not turned up to help at the eatery. It was also she who told relatives that he must have gone to Tongchuan to be with the lover. At first, those lines seemed like housekeeping. Later, they read like lines from a script. The telecom footprints sharpened suspicion. The new number that texted reassurances for 5 days had been registered with Binbin's identification at a Shenmue storefront, the very city where his family lived. And the call forwarding that turned his old phone into a doorbell for Tongchuan, she knew about it. Each technical gesture now looked less like happenstance and more like design. Investigators began to write the word wife on the board, not as a placeholder, but as a hypothesis. But a hypothesis needs a body to wield it. Could she have done it alone? On paper, Binbin had a weakened left leg, and yet still outweighed and outmuscled Liu Yufang. To kill and dispose, with so few seams showing, the odds favored an accomplice. When detectives widened the circle around her days, they found a woman hardened by work, a seamstress, then a market cloth seller, then a tofu maker pushing carts at dawn. Later, she drove a motor tricycle, earned a commercial driver's license, and even hauled coal work that stains the lungs and demands calculation. She was not only tireless, she learned fast. Things she watched once or twice, she could do. Money, after land compensation, was no longer the family's problem. But prosperity had another cost. Distance grew between a woman who moved in wider circles and a husband anchored by injury and habit. Resentment has soil here. It had water. The marriage had long since slid from patience to performance. By 2010, Liu was angry enough to file for divorce, then withdrew it under her daughter's tears. After that, husband and wife lived separate lives. She moved upstairs to the rental rooms with the children. Binbin kept the old house. Rumors seeped the other way too that she had a man of her own. No one could prove it then. As so often, proof would come later. One footprint at a time. One footprint had a name. Zhang Haifeng, born in 1982, a few years younger than Liu, a cook who worked and slept at the eatery. He had a wife and child back in his hometown. He was taller than average, moved with the easy authority of someone who knows his shape in a doorway. His rented room was on the same floor as Liu's, only a few meters away, just enough distance for courtesy, not enough to stop a rumor. If the story needed a second pair of hands, he was close enough to be those hands. With the cast now drawn, detectives restaged the last night. Friends said that on the evening before the disappearance, Binbin drank with a small group at the family eatery. A session that stretched past midnight until the wine pushed him into slurred gratitude. When it ended, Liu got behind the wheel and drove them home one by one. When the last friend stepped out, only 2 people were left in the car, the husband and the wife. That is what the friend remembered. That is what her own statement would later confirm. In her statement, Liu said she brought Binbin back to the old house. It was late, later than 11 at night. Too late, she claimed, to bother driving back to the rooms above the eatery. So she slept there one night. A convenience, nothing more. At 6 in the morning, she said, she woke, drove back to the shop, and left him asleep in bed. When he did not appear later that morning, she did not panic. Only at lunchtime did she call the younger brother and ask him to check. No one answered the locked door. A day later, the texts began. The texts that soothed, delayed, and then died. What does a staged scene look like up close? In this case, like an ordinary marriage night, annotated with small edits. You cannot see the weapon or the act, not yet, but you can see who had custody of the man last. You can see who controlled the car. You can see who had motive to push time forward past a wedding. past Lunar New Year, past the moment when curiosity becomes a police report. The edits curl like smoke above the page. Alongside this reconstruction, police continued to eliminate alternatives. The debt collection crew, who had earlier threatened the couple over an unpaid fee, the one with underworld whispers at their backs, held solid alibis for the critical hours. The ledgers at the eatery and the rental rooms were plain. In the motive triangle of grievance, money and love, the first two had thinned. The third still stood. And Tong Chuan, the lover's anger made sense in its own claustrophobic way. She received a text on the 5th day after he vanished, telling her to meet at the station, then heard a woman's voice say he was drunk and sleeping. She read it as betrayal, found a new boyfriend, and closed her door to the Xie family. For detectives, the same chain read as misdirection, a lure to the wrong city, a plausible voice on a forwarded line, an alibi by distance that could be maintained from a Shenmue counter with the right papers and a steady hand. By the close of this chapter, the investigation's map had changed. It no longer radiated out across provinces. It folded back into a house, a car, a kitchen, and a hallway where two doors stood a few meters apart. If there was a design, its author likely sat at that table, counted that cash drawer, and knew which relatives to text and how to mimic a man who never typed fast. The next step would be to pull at the seams, to test whether the last ride, the overnight stay, and the 6 a.m. departure were memories or masks. For months, the investigation moved like a hand over dusty glass, circling the same prints. Not yet seeing the room, police had already learned that no train manifest and no long-distance bus log placed Shi Binbin in Tongchuan in November of 2011. The lover there had taken up with a new boyfriend after his disappearance, and whatever anger she showed felt human rather than homicidal. That chapter began to look less like a road and more like a painted backdrop. So the detectives turned the map around and studied Shenmue itself, the streets, the eatery, the rental rooms, the short drive to the old house. In their notes, they underlined the small, early acts that had nudged everyone toward the wrong station. Call forwarding that sent Binbin's incoming calls to the lover's number. A brand new line registered with his identification at a Shenmue storefront and used for 5 days to send tidy reassurances before falling silent forever. Such mechanics did not smell like strangers. They smelled like housework. They also underlined 2 sentences that, at first, had sounded like housekeeping. On the noon that Binbin failed to appear at the eatery, his wife phoned the younger brother and asked him to check the house. Then she told relatives she believed he had gone to Tongchuan to be with the lover. In a different story, those lines would have been bland. In this story, they read like cues. Facts still resisted. When officers traced Liu Yufang's route on the night before the disappearance, they found little that a prosecutor could hold. Much of the relevant traffic surveillance had already been recorded over by the time the family reported in the 7th day of the new year. Only one checkpoint camera preserved a single still image from November. It showed Li Yu driving, a man slouched in the passenger seat, his face tipped back and turned away. Impossible to identify. The image was a ghost more than a witness. Searches of the old house turned up nothing urgent. No blood in the bedroom, no disturbed flooring, no ordinary item in an extraordinary place. The kitchen was a kitchen, the bed, a bed. The working theory that the last ride had ended in violence was still only a theory. If Liu had killed him, could she have done it alone? On paper, Binbin had a weakened left leg, but even so, he outweighed and outmuscled her. To kill and dispose without seams showing, the arithmetic suggested another pair of hands. The obvious candidate lived just a few meters down the hallway. Zhang Haifeng, born 1982, a cook who ate and slept at the eatery. Married with a child back in his hometown, he denied everything: the affair, the violence, any knowledge of the disappearance. He said he and Liu were fellow Tongchuan natives, nothing more. A relationship of big sister and little brother in a strange city. In the cramped theater of a local business, that answer could play. For detectives, it was still a line in a script. While statements were gathered, the family did what families do when police work does not move fast enough. They searched, they climbed gullies and traced riverbanks. They peered into caves and walked kettle-dry hills outside Shenmue for months, chasing the same thought to its hard end. If he had been killed, where was the body? They found nothing but wind. Every thread they pulled brought them back to the design in the communications. A friend had dialed the number saved under Binbin's name and reached a woman who insisted the number was hers. That was exactly how call forwarding should feel. At the other end, a plausible wall you could not push through. 5 days after he vanished, Miss Wang received a text telling her to meet at the Tongchuan rail station. When she called back, a woman said he was drunk and sleeping and then hung up. Miss Wang's anger felt authentic, and after that call, Binbin never contacted her again, which did not fit a lover on the run. It fit staging. And then there was the typing itself. People who knew Binbin remembered his slow messages, if he wrote at all. Chinese characters are memorized shapes, not letters assembled from an alphabet. He had studied only through 2nd grade. The person who chatted with the family on the 6th day of the new year, typed with trained speed, refused a video call by saying he was outside, then went offline. It sounded like someone impersonating a rhythm they did not truly know. By late winter, the case had the shape of a room with no door. The lover in Tongchuan looked less and less like a killer. The debt collection crew who had once threatened the couple over an unpaid fee held solid alibis for the crucial window. The money ledger at the eatery was ordinary. The grievance pillar wobbled. What remained was love, or its reverse: jealousy, humiliation, control, and a design that kept pointing inward, toward the home. Investigators debated tools. Without a body, without forensic sign, without a confession. They needed either a witness brave enough to break a family, or a test sharp enough to pierce a mask. That was when someone proposed the polygraph. The plan was simple in outline. Bring in Liu Yufang and Zhang Haifeng. Wire them to the machine. Let the needles write their music. The goal was not merely results. It was pressure. Some people confess not to science, but to the room. There was a legal hitch. Under the regulations then, police could not compel a polygraph for people not yet charged unless they consented. Consent is a thin word that carries heavy air. Would Liu agree to be tested about her husband's disappearance? Would Zhang? Refusal would not prove guilt, but acceptance could tip a balance in interviews that followed. Detectives reached for the phone and prepared the paperwork. Before they called, they looked once more at the timeline built from a wedding, a drive, and a morning. On the night before the disappearance, a small group drank at the family eatery until after midnight. Liu drove people home one by one. When the last friend stepped out, only husband and wife were left in the car. Liu later said she took him to the old house, then slept there herself because it was late. At 6 in the morning, she drove back to the shop, leaving him asleep. By lunchtime, with no sign of him, she called the younger brother to check the house. After that, the texts began. If those are only memories, they are tender ones. If they are masks, They are good masks, stitched from routine, softened by plausible care. The detectives had long since drawn the motive triangle grievance: money, love, and set it on the board like a compass rose. The arrows no longer aimed at Tongchuan train schedules or debt collector alibis. They pointed instead to a hallway where two doors stood only a few meters apart, to a kitchen that preserved nothing but smells, to a car that turned right and then off camera, to a single photograph of a woman driving and a man whose face could not be seen. When a pattern is this carefully constructed, the question is no longer whether there was a design. It is who drew it and how to make them speak. Part 6 ends with the detectives loading a different instrument, not a shovel for gullies or a camera for roads, but a machine that listens to bodies. If consent comes, the room will tighten. If it does not, the refusal will still hum in the notes of the case. Either way, the wall of silence has a new seam to pull. The room chosen for the test was bright, in a bureaucratic way: white paint, a metal desk, a chair with arms that remembered other bodies. Liu Yufang arrived with the calm of someone certain that control was a posture. She signed the consent form, sat, and watched a technician strap the cuffs and bands that would listen to her body. The plan had called for 2 subjects, but Zhang Haifeng, the cook from the eatery down the hall, refused the polygraph. That left Liu alone with the machine. The questions that day read like a slow blade. They began with anchors: her name, her child's name, the year, the city. Then they shifted. Did you see your husband after the early morning of November? Did you handle his phone? Were you involved in forwarding his calls? Did you help register a new number with his identification? Wires recorded the small, involuntary signatures of a body under pressure: breath, pulse, blood pressure. The rhythm, a chest keeps despite the mouth. After half a day, the conclusion came back. The charts suggested deception on multiple items related to Xie Binbin's disappearance and the phone manipulations that followed. It was direction, not proof. Polygraphs in criminal investigations are guides, not evidence. They catch edges of fear and stress, but anxiety itself can sharpen those edges. The readout could not be taken to court. It could be taken back to the whiteboard. Detectives resisted the temptation to declare victory. They had been fooled before by tidy shapes. They had learned that a design silence call forwarding to a lover's phone, a brand new line registered with the victim's papers and used for 5 days of tidy texts, could make a lie feel like routine. What the test gave them was a compass pointing inward, toward the home, toward the hands that knew which relatives to text, and how to imitate a man who typed slowly if he typed at all. When interviews and searches failed to produce a break, time did its patient work. By 2013, Liu closed the eatery and kept only the rental rooms. She moved with her 2 children back into the old house that had once been her husband's orbit. Zhang Haifeng left Shenmu for Tongchuan, returned to his hometown work, and the daily proximity that had fueled rumor evaporated. Police did not stop watching. They learned that Liu spent most days close to home, collecting rent from tenants, then sinking into long games of mahjong at a neighborhood parlor where tiles clacked like teeth. Undercover officers took seats at those tables, playing hands and harvesting talk. Out of those quiet weeks came a new thread. A boyfriend, a man surnamed Doan, met across the green mat and the steam of tea. The relationship thickened. He stayed overnight often enough that neighbors stopped craning their necks to confirm it. In small cities, secrets are measured not by what is hidden, but by how quickly people stop mentioning what they know. Detectives ask themselves the basic question: any fresh intimacy invites What did she tell him? This was a disappearance that had become a kind of public story in Shenmue. How do you date the woman at the center of a town's whisper and avoid the topic that makes her a whisper at all? Approaching Mr. Doan directly risked spooking Liu, so officers found a different edge. The wife. She, too, knew about the affair. She had confronted him before, and she now told police something the investigation had never heard. Her husband had helped Liu delete footage from a car's dashboard camera. Liu had explained it away as a traffic violation she feared would bring a ticket later. The excuse was weak. Tickets in such cases rarely depend on a driver's personal dash cam, and officers do not trawl private devices to write fines. Why, then, erase a day? The absence felt surgical, the way a missing page in a ledger warns you more than a red number does. Theories hardened. Perhaps the camera had captured a route to a disposal site. Perhaps a shadow in a headlight. Perhaps the weight of a bundle carried across the nose of the car. If Liu needed help to delete footage, then the man who helped would have asked why. Maybe he had watched the files. Maybe he knew more than he understood. Whatever he knew, he carried it loosely enough to keep seeing her and to keep staying over. Some people call that loyalty. Investigators call it gravity. The pull between complicity and desire. They watched Mr. Doan more closely. Surveillance noted a different habit that could become a lever. He sometimes used drugs with a small circle of friends. April of 2014 gave police an opening. They raided a hotel room and found him with several users and enough residue to lock the door behind them. He was booked for illegal drug use, taken to a precinct room where there was no mahjong table to explain absence and no lover's house to run to afterward. Here, investigators thought, was the first new wall in years that might echo when struck. While arrangements were made for questioning, the case file was rearranged in a way that felt almost ceremonial. Tabs straightened, photos re-sleeved. The polygraph report slid nearer to the front. It told a story on its own. Liu consenting to the machine while Zhang refused. Needles that sang of deception. The cold fact that such songs are inadmissible in court, useful only as a map. The file also held the older, heavier paper of the case. No train or bus record of Bin Bin in Tongchuan during November of 2011. The lover who had a new boyfriend after his disappearance, and the impatience that sounded like a door closing. Communication logs showing call forwarding to the lover's phone, and a new line registered in Shenmue with the victim's identification and used for 5 days of texting before being killed. Every page pointed inward, toward a home that had learned to speak in other voices. Detectives returned to first principles. In most violent stories, the roof is held up by 3 pillars: grievance, money, and love. And they had shaken the first 2 until dust fell. Business brought no feud big enough to swallow a man. The debt collectors who once threatened the couple over unpaid fees had clean alibis. The ledgers were dull. Love, or the humiliations and controls that are its shadow, was the only pillar still bearing weight. Miss Wang, the lover in Tongchuan, now looked like a decoy that others had prepared. A plausible wall created by forwarding calls to her number and sending texts from a 5-day line that said, "I am fine," and then died. And now there was Mr. Doan, the boyfriend met over tiles and tea, the man who deleted a day. He would sit in a room that had no ashtrays and listen to questions that began as politely as paperwork and ended as sharp as loss. Investigators would ask about the dashcam, what he saw, what he removed, what words Liu used to make a deletion feel like a favor. They would ask whether he had heard her account of the night before Bin Bin vanished. whether he had absorbed the wedding, the texts, the locked door, the sixth-day chat, the season when a family waited through Lunar New Year for a man who never came home. They would ask about fear, whether he had felt any on the nights he slept over, which is a way of asking whether fear belonged to him at all. Part 7 ends at the threshold of that interview. A polygraph's hum had already told detectives they were walking the right corridor. Tong Chuan had faded into painted scenery. A new boyfriend had stepped out of background and into focus, carrying the fact of an erased day. The machine's needles could not testify, but perhaps a lover's pride, jealousy, or carelessness would. In cases built on designed silences, progress is measured not by confessions, but by new seams to pull. Here at last was one you could catch with your fingernails. Breakthroughs, when they come, rarely look like triumph. They look like a tired man in a small interview room, caught for something else, talking because silence suddenly costs more. In April 2014, officers brought in Mr. Doan, the new boyfriend from the mahjong parlor, on a drug charge. Away from tiles and tea, his story finally spilled. Liu Yufang had told him her husband hadn't been murdered at all. It was an accident, a collision by a well-connected driver who paid to make the problem disappear. She said the body had been buried before dawn on a mountain at the edge of Shenmue, and she had taken hush money of over 1 million yuan, rather than report it. When police asked if he knew where, he said he did. They took him there on the 22nd of April. Lan Chen Ling Isha Se. He could not point to an exact spot, only near here. Excavators chewed through the foot of the mountain for 3 days. On the afternoon of the 25th of April, the bucket brought up a human skeleton. DNA said what everyone already feared. It was Xie Binbin, missing for more than 2 years. Shenmue police arrested Liu Yufang at once. She stared stone-faced and said nothing. They also moved on Zhang Haifeng, the tall cook, who had once lived a few meters down the corridor from Liu, under questioning. Zhang dropped the "we are just fellow Tongchuan native" story and admitted the relationship. Then he described the night. After the drinking party, Liu did not drive her husband back to the old house. She steered to the eatery and called Zhang down. In the car, she handed him an electrical cord and told him to strangle Xie Binbin. He balked. She threatened to call his wife back home and blow up his life. He tightened the cord. When the breath stopped, they drove to the mountain foot and buried the body. Confronted with both statements, Liu kept her mask for a while longer, then cracked. She cried and admitted ordering Zhang to kill her husband. She offered 3 reasons, small and cruel in their ordinariness: that he was disabled and ugly, that he drank and cursed and sometimes hit her, and that he kept a mistress and wanted to spend the recovered debt money on an apartment for that woman, the last straw. In her telling, fatigue hardened into planning. Even now, detectives did not forget the design that had delayed this moment. The call forwarding that turned Xia's phone into a gate to the lover. The new SIM registered in Shenmue with Xia's ID and used for 5 days to text reassurances before going dark. The 6th-day chat during Lunar New Year, typed with suspicious speed by someone who refused a video call, and the station text that lured the Tongchuan mistress to wait for a man who would never arrive. Together, those moves had pointed everyone away from Shenmue and toward a distant city, buying time for the grave to settle. By the time of the arrests, police had already tested and discarded other roads. No train or bus records ever placed Xia in Tongchuan in November 2011. The lover there had taken up with a new boyfriend and bristled at being dragged back into the story, which read less like guilt than escape. The grievance pillar feuds. Business enemies was hollow. The debt collectors who once threatened the couple over unpaid fees had solid alibis. The map kept folding back into a house, a car, and a hallway with two doors a few meters apart. A year earlier, the polygraph had pointed inward as well. Liu consented, and the traces read deception on key questions about the disappearance and phone manipulations. Zhang refused the test. Polygraphs are guides, not evidence. But that needle had already been telling detectives they were walking the right corridor. Now the corridor had a room at the end of it, and inside the room were bones. For a moment, revisit Mr. Doan's accident story, because even lies carry fingerprints. He said a powerful driver had pleaded and paid, that Liu took the money and agreed to a secret burial. Two truths peek through. First, the burial site. He led police to the right mountain, close enough that 3 days of digging found the grave. Second, the deletion. His own wife told police he had helped Liu erase a day from a dashcam, which makes no sense for a mere traffic ticket, but perfect sense if the camera had captured a route, a bundle's weight, or a face in a headlight. He may not have known the whole story, but he knew there was a story to hide. When you put the case on a single page, its spine is painfully straight. Wedding missing chair, locked door at noon, forwarded calls, 5-day number, 6-day chat, months of waiting, polygraph, a new boyfriend who deleted a day, a mountain grave, a cook who finally said what the room already suspected, and a wife who called it fatigue and humiliation and money. From beginning to end, the authorship of the silence was domestic. In the early days, Miss Wang in Tongchuan had looked like the most obvious suspect because design stories prefer obvious. She received the station text, called back, and a woman answered, saying she was drunk and sleeping, then hung up. She raged, found someone new, and wanted nothing more to do with Shenmu. Those beats sounded petty, not predatory, exactly the instrument a designer would use. A real person's emotions plucked to play the wrong tune. The legal process would take its course from here. But narratively, the way families tell the year to each other over dinner, the case ends with 3 images. The first is the 25th of April. Laotianling Ishisu, a backhoe's bucket, lifting bones from red earth, and a family that finally has a place to grieve. The second is Zhang in a chair, describing a cord in his hands and a threat about a phone call home. The third is Liu, face wet, saying out loud the resentments she had been living for years. Behind those images sits the quieter machinery you saw all along. Forwarding, registration, typing, timing the housework of vanishing a man. The courtroom was crowded in the way small cities gather. Neighbors pressed shoulder to shoulder. Reporters perched on the edge of benches. Family in the front row, with hands clenched into their own clothes. In October 2014, the court sentenced Liu Yufang and Zhang Haifeng to death for intentional homicide. It sounded like a hammer striking marble final, echoing, inevitable only in hindsight. Outside, Shenmu slipped back toward ordinary time. Inside, a family finally knew where to bring incense. But a verdict is only the last page. To understand how the book closes, you have to trace your finger back through the lines, through the first text that said he'd gone to Tongchuan, through forwarded calls that rang a mistress's phone, through a 5-day number registered with his ID in Shenmu, and then killed, through a 6th-day chat during the New Year, typed by someone too swift for a man who rarely typed at all. Each of those steps was domestic labor in disguise, the housework of vanishing a man. The beginning looked like a wedding video. Late 2011, a niece in silk and light. A missing chair, where an uncle had promised to sit as master of ceremonies in the days before that celebration. The wife called the younger brother at noon. asking him to check the house because She Binbin had not shown up at the eatery. The door was locked from the outside. A day later came the message from a new number. He'd gone to Tongchuan to buy a home and live with his lover. It was everything people already whispered, which is why it worked. Investigators did not let rumor do their work. They pulled call records and found two strange signatures. First, Binbin's phone had been set to forward calls to the lover's number, a feature common to hotlines, rare for individuals. Second, one day after he vanished, a new line was registered with his identification in a Shenmue storefront, used to text relatives and friends for 5 days before going dark. If a man simply runs, he does not volunteer to manage his own customer service. Someone else was answering the door. The family tried to believe the texts. They waited through Lunar New Year, and on the 6th day, they even chatted with him online. Yet the rhythm was wrong. Fast, practiced typing, where Binbin, who had studied only through 2nd grade, would hunt and peck at characters he barely knew. When they asked for a video call, he said he was outside and went offline. The next morning, they filed a report. Already months late. Police tested the obvious lane Tongchuan and found it empty. No train or long-distance bus record placed Binbin there in November 2011. The mistress had moved on with a new boyfriend and wanted nothing more to do with the drama. The grievance pillar shook and lightened. Money, the recovered loan. The quarrel with debt collectors, who later produced clean alibis, thinned as well. The map kept refolding into a house, a car, a hallway with 2 doors, a few meters apart. Evidence fought back. By the time the family reported the disappearance on the 7th day of the new year, much traffic surveillance had been overwritten. One checkpoint still yielded a single photo from November. Liu driving, a man in the passenger seat with his face tipped away. Unidentifiable, a ghost more than a witness. Searches of the old house found nothing urgent. No blood, no disturbed flooring, just a bed that kept its silence. Lacking a body or a scene, detectives reached for pressure. They proposed a polygraph admissible as guidance, not proof. Liu consented. Zhang refused. After half a day, the charts suggested deception on key questions about the disappearance and the phone manipulations that followed. The needles could not testify, but they could point inward, toward a home that had learned to speak in other voices. Time passed, and with it, proximity. The eatery closed in 2013. Zhang returned to Tongchuan. Liu moved with the children back into the old house. New patterns appeared. Mahjong afternoons, and a boyfriend met across the green mat and steam of tea. His wife later told police he had helped Liu delete a day from a car's dashcam, allegedly to hide a traffic violation. An explanation that explained nothing. You don't need to erase a personal camera to avoid a ticket. You erase it to remove a route, a bundle's weight, a face in a headlight. In April 2014, officers arrested the boyfriend, Mr. Doan, on a drug charge. Away from tiles and tea, he spoke. He said Liu told him it had been an accident, a well-connected driver who paid to make the problem disappear. He said the body had been buried before dawn on a mountainside at Shenmue's edge, and that he could lead police near the spot. They let machines chew the earth for 3 days. On the 25th of April, Liaoqianling Yishisi, a bucket brought up bones. DNA wrote the name everyone feared, Shi Binbin. With the grave uncovered, Zhang Haifeng finally abandoned the "we are only fellow Tongchuan natives" script. He admitted the affair and described the night after the drinking party. Liu did not drive her husband to the old house. She steered to the eatery, called Zhang down, handed him an electrical cord. threatened to call his wife if he refused, and ordered him to strangle Bin Bin. They buried the body at the foot of the mountain. Under that weight, Liu broke crying as she admitted ordering the killing and reciting reasons small and cruel, disability and ugliness, drinking and curses and blows, and the plan to use recovered money to buy a home for the mistress, the last straw. Even in confession, the earlier design remained the telltale art, forwarding the phone to the lover's number, registering a new SIM in Shenmue with his papers, and using it to text for 5 days, typing like a stranger who had practiced, sending a station text to lure the mistress into waiting for a man who would never arrive. Those gestures did not belong to chance or to a passerby. They belonged to someone who knew the family tree well enough to message the right relatives. There is a temptation to make morality grand at the end, to intone about greed and jealousy and duty. The facts here are humbler and, for that reason, harder. Liu Yufang once considered divorce. Her eldest daughter begged her not to. To leave would mean dividing property she had fought to build. She stayed. In staying, she tolerated the ordinary humiliations of a failing marriage until toleration curdled into calculation. When money came back into the house and Bin Bin spoke openly of an apartment for the mistress, she decided that murder was simpler than separation. A night of heavy drinking supplied the opportunity. A man down the hall supplied a second pair of hands. The court sentence cannot teach love, but this story can still teach something more practical. It warns families to be skeptical of digital reassurances, of call-forwarded voices, of brand new numbers that live only 5 days, of fast chats in the name of people who type slowly. It reminds investigators that designed silence often looks like housework, errands, registrations, messages, small edits to routines, and it asks the rest of us a quieter question. When a relationship rots, do we choose the pain of honest division or the fantasy of removing the obstacle? The former is difficult. The latter is monstrous, and neither is free. On the day sentence was read, 3 images sat behind the judge's words. First, the wedding video that began the search, a missing chair where a promise should have been. Second, a single still frame of a woman driving, and a man whose face could not be seen. Third, a mountain grave, and a bucket lifting bones into light. Between them runs a line you can trace with your finger. Forwarded calls, 5-day texts, 6th-day chat, months of waiting. Polygraph, a boyfriend who deleted a day. Confession, verdict. It is a straight line once you let yourself see it.